All right, today we've got Laura Marshal. She is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at Colorado State University. She is working on a project with Camille Stevens-Ruman at CSU and Paula Fornwat at Rocky Mountain Research Station on seedling survival and growth in post-fire plantings on national forest lands. She has experience in forest and fire ecology in the southwestern United States, including dendrochronology, growth and ecophysiology of conifers, demography and community dynamics with field and leveraging extant large data sets for new research, and an interest in the intersection of changing disturbance regimes and climate as a driver of community change. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from the University of Arizona, a Master's of Science in Earth System Science from the University of California, Irvine, and a PhD in Natural Resources from the University of Arizona. Her PhD research in the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research involved tree growth and community response to climate, topography, and disturbance in southwestern conifer forests. That's really exciting. Thank you so much for being here. Laura, take it away, please.
Great, thank you for that introduction. And just to start off, I'm going to apologize in advance if you hear any meowing over the mic. My cat just woke up, and if I lock her in the other room, she'll definitely be meowing, so she'll settle down. So let's just get started. Okay, everything look good?
Looks great, thank you.
All right. So today I'm going to talk about long-term post-fire management. And generally speaking, what I consider like long-term is the time between one fire and the next. So that could be a relatively short period if you're looking at a frequent fire forest. And so just to get started, I'm going to go through some of the relevant background. I'm sure, well, as you're saying, since this is like the 10th in a series, that there's been a fair amount of talk about past disturbance, what fire exclusion has done to the forests of the West, and major goals of restoration, including restoring frequent fire. And what all this leads into is how do forests recover after fire, and do they recover? And what can we do to affect that? In terms of that, I'll be looking at predominantly seedling planting and outcomes in post-fire management. So just to set the stage, as everybody is, I'm sure, well aware by now, that 2020 was just an extraordinary fire season in the Western US. And a lot of that was just the really extreme hot, dry climate conditions found across, especially the Southwest. There seemed to be major fires popping up on a weekly basis from May until practically October. And of course, in Colorado, there were a number of major events that were record-breaking in size, and elsewhere there were as well. I was in Tucson through most of the summer, and we had a major local event there as well that I'll probably reference later. But of course, what we're seeing here is some of this extreme burned area is probably related to trends in vapor pressure deficit, which is kind of a interpretation of temperature and relative humidity. So the higher it is, the hotter and drier it is, and the more it burns. And 2020 was definitely on the extreme, but over the past couple decades, we've been seeing higher trend in vapor pressure deficit and fire size, just based on this little paper that note, I guess, that came out in October. So setting the stage locally, what does that extreme fire in recent years look like? Through 2018, of course, there were a number of major fires in the Colorado Front Range area, largely in ponderosa pine dry mixed conifer forests that tend to be hotter and drier regardless of the year. 2020 was somewhat exceptional compared to these previous large events, that a lot of the kind of wetter areas burned, the higher elevation spruce fir, lodgepole, wet mixed conifer, that you really only expect to see burn in the really extreme hot, dry years. And of course, when the wind was behind it, it blew all the way to the edge of the tree line practically, as with Cameron Peak. So we're basically seeing big increases in fire severity in multiple different forest types, particularly what historically has been frequent fire with low severity, such as ponderosa pine. If you look at broader areas across the west and southwest, you're just seeing larger fires burning more severely in areas that historically didn't do that as much. And of course, all these fires are examples of disturbance, which causes changes to the forest, particularly altering stand structure, the continuity of fuels, and can increase general stress, leading to increased tree mortality under other conditions such as drought, insect outbreaks, and of course, climate change. And a lot of what's driving this, at least in frequent fire forests in the Western US, is the legacy of fire exclusion. Over the 20th century, there was basically fire exclusion, both through grazing initially and then active suppression to basically put fires out as much as possible. And in systems that are primed to burn every 10 to 20 years, that leads to big increases in density. You can see on the left there is one of my favorite historic photos from the Jemez Mountains in 1929, showing what's just starting to be a bumper crop of seedlings. I think that the caption quotes that it's ponderosa pine forest showing good regeneration, which, you know, if you want a very dense forest with lots of opportunities for logging, I guess that's okay to start out with. But if you leave all those seedlings to grow, you don't have fire on that landscape. What you end up with 100 years later is a extremely dense overgrown forest with high fuel continuity that is just primed to burn. And when that hits, such as during an extreme weather event, these bottom photos are from the Las Conchas fire in northern New Mexico in 2011, which sparked off by a power line falling and burned through, let's see, what was it, like 16,000 acres in the first day at relatively high severity, and burning down overnight into pinyon juniper woodland, which generally does not burn. So on the right there, we have a burned out giant old pinyon that probably had been standing there for hundreds of years since, and now it's just a bare landscape. So this is just massive change on a large scale that we haven't really been seeing, largely driven by past changes to the system. Now, of course, eventually land managers realized, hey, these ponderosa pine forests and many other these frequent fire forests need fire. It's not great to have them extremely overgrown, and the goal there is basically to be reintroducing and restoring frequent fire to these frequent fire systems. And doing that, you'll change that fuel structure, maybe the species composition. By opening up the forest, you really change the understory and allow much greater species diversity than in a closed canopy forest. And here we can see two photos from where they've been working to restore frequent fire on the Walhalla Plateau in Grand Canyon National Park. You see after the first fire, still very dense and closed, but with multiple fire entries, they were able to open that up, which is great, except what I'm not showing you here is patches of these prescribed fires that burned severely, relatively small, especially compared to the major extreme fires that we've seen in the last few years. But with repeat fire, the trees that were killed in the previous fire were burning hot and kind of expanding on those severe patches. So though they were restoring frequent fire and improving the quality of the forest over a large area, these severe patches were causing a persistent problem and potentially leading to vegetation conversion to non-forest in these patches. And what they're working with, which I've heard in talks and from talking with Chris Marks, who's managing this program up there, is by changing the timing of when they're doing the management actions. So by going in and burning in the winter, late fall, of these dead down trees, you reduce the fuel load. And when you do reintroduce fire, for the next burn, you're not getting that really high intensity burn where you had the previous high severity. And I'm hoping everybody's on the same page about intensity and severity. If you're confused, drop a note in the, and we can address that later. So one thing that I've been talking about over and over in the past year when I talk about these fires is, are these good or bad fires? And I just wanted to address this here because when you're talking about good or bad, I think it's very place and time specific. So you're considering what's the historic fire regime and what are the fire effects on the forest and the community. So up on the upper left is a picture that I just got off of Twitter. So sorry, there's no attribution, but it's a picture from Rocky Mountain National Park for the East Troublesome Fire. And attached to it were all these comments like, oh no, this is horrible, what's going on? But as like a fire ecologist, when I look at that picture, what I see is a ground fire burning through heavy grasses and fuels at the edge of a riparian system, leaving the large standing trees to survive. So I'd probably consider at least this part of this fire a good fire, because you're just, you're not killing off those trees. You seem to be just burning through the grasses at a low rate. And that's probably about what you want on that site. Not having gone there personally, I can't say for sure, but I'd expect like next spring that all that grass would start growing just fine in the next few months. And to contrast that, in a completely different system, these are the Pinaleios Mountains in Arizona, which has experienced a number of large fire events over the past few decades, mirroring many areas of the West. And it's particularly notable because it's some of the lowest in latitude spruce fir forest in the US, and is home to the Mount Graham red squirrel, which is an endemic, extremely endangered squirrel that they've studied a lot at the University of Arizona. And in 2017, they had the Fry Fire, which burnt through about 98% of the spruce fir forest and left, you know, images like you see on the left all over, just standing dead trees with regrowing understory. But is that a good or a bad fire? Because spruce fir forest burns every few hundred years at high intensity. That's its normal fire regime. However, with all the other considerations, kind of makes it more complicated. You have the endemic squirrels that were knocked down to like almost single digit numbers after the Fry Fire. They've been increasing in part because of feeding and other management work, but with other pressing issues of like invasive squirrels that are crowding out the red squirrels and climate change, you increase the chance that you're going to have something else come back instead of spruce fir. And whether that'll happen, you kind of have to wait, you know, a few hundred years to see, since that's kind of the normal trajectory of succession for that forest. So it can be very hard, basically, to say whether a given fire is good or bad, or even if a given spot in the fire is good or bad. But it's interesting to think about. So what happens after a fire? Presumably you see some kind of recovery. In the past, you'll hear people talk about successional trajectories, where you start with one thing and you go directly to another thing. That's less of kind of the ideal view, what I consider. But basically, it's still a convenient way to talk about how things change. And particularly, there are a couple of terms. So we have vegetation type conversion, where you have forest and it changes type. So from forest to shrubs, from forest to grass, but you're not going to have forest again after you lose it. If you have a resistant forest, it'll just stay a forest through a disturbance. So maybe the fire is not severe through that area. Maybe something else happens that just lets the forest stay a forest. If you overcome that, you have a change. So maybe you lose the overstory, you have a severe burn, but if the resilience is intact, it'll eventually return back to that former state. So like a spruce fir forest that has a hot burn, kills all the mature trees, but you know, in like lodgepole pine that needs that fire, it'll just resprout. And you know, if you wait 200 years, you'll have lodgepole pine again. So that is where you get into the dotted line at the, you know, time frame of hundreds to even 1,000 years, where you're not, it's hard to be entirely sure that, you know, you have that resilience intact in some systems. In others, like frequent fire forests, you probably know on a matter of decades whether or not you're seeing a persistent conversion or not. Mhm. Okay. So I have a couple examples of what I'd consider vegetation type changes after fire in these following slides. Here we have type change, so it's conversion from forest to non-forest. In this case, it's in the Aspen Fire, which is the Catalinas just outside Tucson, which happened in about 2003. And the same area burned over again this last summer in the Bighorn Fire. After the Aspen Fire, in areas that had burned severely, such as this patch on the left, you can see standing dead snags that were former, conifer trees, but everything growing up is essentially oak. And that's because in the past, this was a pine oak woodland, but the major fire comes through, the oak resprouts, and this seed dispersing conifers just can't recolonize quickly enough. They take longer time to establish. They have to come from further away. And in that time, the oak grows up and is able to just take over all the available habitat. And that's, I think, a really relatively common way, I guess, to get into oak scrubland or oak patches, which you see over many mountain ranges, especially in northern New Mexico that I've worked in. And you can also see just grass after fire. So this is from the High Park Fire. It's just a few thousand acres of just grass where there used to be trees off in the distance in those ravines, and now they all died in the fire and nothing sprouting in the almost 10 years since. So that's a forest to grass conversion example. It's not all bad. I don't like putting only bad conversion pictures in. So here's an example that's more resilience. This is on the Ben de la Torre Scout Ranch from a field trip I took a couple years ago, looking at a prescribed burn that had basically mixed severity effects. So there are some patches that burnt more severely, some larger trees that died, but many areas that just burned through the understory like you'd like in a frequent fire forest. So it is possible to open up these forests ahead of fire, I guess. So it's kind of the pre-fire management, preparing for a post-fire condition. Now, where this kind of starts to run into difficulty and increasing chance of type conversion versus recovery back to that, former forest condition is where you run into feedbacks and influences of warmer climate. So some species and conditions lend themselves to repeat burning, especially in places where you have issues with invasive grasses. So I'm thinking cheatgrass in like the Great Basin. And in the Sonoran Desert, you worry a lot about buffalo grass moving in. Those are species or grass species that are just primed to burn frequently at high severity and will kill off the dominant overstory plants, whether that's trees or saguaro cacti in Arizona. And that'll eventually tip you down the slide into non-forest condition with repeat, disturbance at a relatively short time frame that doesn't allow the mature trees or any seedlings that establish to escape from fire risk. And kind of, this is a relatively complicated figure that talks about the processes that feed into that conversion process. So in a fire, for example, severe fire, you have, say, a large patch driven by wind, goes through crown fire and you lose all the trees in, 100-acre patch. Okay, so you've lost the trees, and that leads to change in the microclimate conditions on the site. So it's a lot hotter and drier without that canopy cover. You're having less likelihood that you'll have seedlings both established if they're at a far distance to the surviving trees, and also that they'll be able to make it in that harsher climate. And if you have additional fire come through, other disturbances, drought, you'll have basically, again, just less chance that any seedlings that make it into that area will survive. And you end up in a conversion to, say, oak woodland if there are oaks on the site, or grass if it's just grass. Okay, so here's some examples of these kind of conversion post-fire trajectories. This big one is Yellowstone, where at the time was the most extreme fire anybody could imagine, but it was largely a high severity fire in subalpine and lodgepole pine forest, so it's relatively natural for that. It's its natural fire regime, and through management, they were able to accelerate it more towards for a forested landscape at perhaps a sooner scale than it would hit otherwise. You have other fires like Las Conchas, which I showed pictures of in the beginning, where you have this a large high severity event, except it's more in dry mixed conifer that would be more frequent low to mixed severity in the past. So you end up with these major 1,000-acre areas that are probably in the process of converting from forest to oak shrubland or something else. And basically here you're just worrying about the magnitude of difference between where you're starting and where you end up after fire, and the likelihood that you can get back there through management actions or just naturally. And so how you handle this in terms of management is largely concerning seedling establishment. When you're thinking long-term, you're thinking on the scale of decades to centuries of returning a forest to a forested condition or maintaining that forest as a forest. And of course, the Forest Service has a mandate to do that. And by doing, basically, they have to be do planting and monitor the natural regeneration. Where there's regeneration failures, you're more likely to see a necessity for planting. But the scale of the areas without trees is so large that it's kind of increasingly difficult to ensure that that happens everywhere it needs to, based just with the limited resources that we have available. On the right, there is a classic Colorado fire that used to be one of the larger fires until that last year. We have the Hayman fire, where you see these large patches where the conifer forest is just gone. While some areas you have refugia that provide some seed source, some ability for the forest to expand into the treeless patches, but at a relatively slow rate. And you're just, well, we're talking about spatial scales. I wanted to address kind of the scale of management. So when you're talking about planting, that happens basically seedling by seedling. And each seedling is put out into a certain stand in a unit at a certain amount, or sorry, excuse me. So at a certain density in accordance with the plan for the planting. And some of that depends on site accessibility, steepness, and resources you have for planting. That unit is found in more of a landscape scale, which is often what I work with. That's possibly a smaller watershed unit out on the land that could be 100 to 1,000 acres or so. And that fits into a larger watershed and landscape, such as the Cache la Poudre there. But when you're working on this, pretty much it all starts basically at that individual seedling. And so this is a kind of cheater graph I put together that, notice here the big difference on the scale at the left. I had to have that different scale because if you have it on the same one, you can't see the planting at all. It just looks like a little green line across the bottom. So this is basically the planting in major fires in Colorado for the past 15 years or so in amount of acres compared with the acres of area burned in Colorado. Though this is all areas, including so grassland fires, other areas, but with U.S. Forest Service land identified as probably a more forested land area identifier. So there you see, big line in 2002 is largely that Hayman fire. Slowly goes through 2018 and 19 because it was data from the 2019 that I collected from NIFC. 2020 will have another huge bar once we get that up. Okay, and so in that Hayman fire, we're seeing these large areas that are essentially have been converting to grass and shrubs in the center of high severity patches that have lacked planting. They've done quite a bit of planting into this fire, but just as a matter of resources and scale, you just can't get everywhere that needs it if you want forest back. And what we found, as in this paper, that past about 90 to 100 meters from the seed trees, you see almost or very limited regeneration. If you get more than 200 meters, it's very unlikely that you'll have relatively a decent amount of natural regeneration on this open area, and then you end up with conversion. And a lot of that's because when you're looking at ponderosa pine, it has these big, heavy cones, and they just can't go very far in one generation. And that's why planting is basically a requirement if you have these large patches, treeless patches. And then there's more contributing issues. So there's kind of an issue with recovery that climate change and drought really interfere with seedling survival. The environmental requirements for seedling are much tighter than for a mature tree. So you need basically all the conditions to align to get really good regeneration to happen. And sometimes it does happen even with like the ongoing drought and other issues, climate change. On the left there is Monument Canyon Research Natural Area, which is one of the spots I worked in for my doctorate. And I'll talk a little bit about it later, but there they did thinning and produced a really great microclimate for these trees to grow. So they, with one good moisture year, you ended up with thousands of seedlings per hectare. So it's still possible to see regeneration even in a long-term drought if you're in the very right spot. But if you're remote from seed trees, if you're in an exposed landscape, it's just really unlikely that you're going to have a lot of natural regenerative success, and it's more likely that you're going to need some management intervention with planting in order to maintain a forested landscape. And you can pretty precisely identify when is it too hot and dry. So this is a fun paper that identified like the climate threshold. So how hot and dry can it get before your seedlings die off? And doing that, they were able to identify specific years and places where you're more likely to have recruitment events. And you can see over time, those dots, which are individual recruitment events where it's kind of cooler and wetter, they are not as common after the year 2000. So that's that kind of persistent local and sometimes west-wide drought that's we've been dealing with, that's contributing to more severe fire and seedling regeneration issues. So it's kind of hitting it on both sides. And that all means that conversion to non-forest is more likely if you have these large post-fire treeless patches. So how we can deal with all this is basically through adaptive management practices. So whether that's through planting or any other management technique that you're going to use. So first, you really need to identify what your values, goals, and desired conditions are for a site. So here's this Monument Canyon example in northern Mexico. So on the left, on the top, we had this extremely overgrown, dense dog hair thicket, we call it, that basically is so many small trees that you can't walk through it. And most of those trees are 80 or so years old in that photo. They're just extremely overgrown. So they came through, thinned the site to try and reduce that density, allow the large overstory trees a chance at surviving. And they did that, in this case, through mastication, and the material was left on the site, which provided a great mulch layer for seedlings to grow in. So we saw that the current conditions were extremely dense. It needed treatment to reduce the density and hopefully maintain the overstory trees and allow fire to return into that area without completely burning everything. But by that first step of thinning and mastication, it worked to reduce the density, but immediately after that, this huge crop of seedlings grew back up. So what we learned there is that this area is really great at growing ponderosa pine. There's this layer of pumice basically in the soil that really contributes to moisture retention. So it's a little bit wetter and moisture, and with that layer of mulch on top, it was just able to sprout up everything. And that's how we ended up with that first picture. If you let that grow another 80 years, it would have returned straight to what it had been after fire exclusion. So once you have that condition, you move through this adaptive management plan. So you identify the goals, you assess what's there, you implement a treatment plan. But if something unexpected happens, if you're not meeting your goals, you change it and try something else. In this case, the ultimate goal is to reintroduce fire and tie it into a larger landscape scale fire management program. And they were able to do that and put in a prescribed burn in the fall, a few years after the thinning. And that did go through and substantially reduce the seedling crop there, as you'd expect after fire, and while allowing most of the large mature trees to survive. So that, now that happened without completely torching everything, they're able to tie it into a larger management plan and kind of continue to monitor and meet those goals to reintroduce fire. And there you're kind of working post-fire, from fire to fire, to just keep this landscape on somewhat of, a frequent fire regime. Okay, so where you do use planting, basically there's some aspects that will really influence whether you have seedling survival and success of the planting. And there are issues, there could be a risk of insect outbreak and managing the dead standing wood that lead to kind of a range of outcomes. Maybe in a lot of places, unfortunately, you see the seedling die or just vanish. Others, it'll just stay present and not grow very well. Others, you'll see a big sprout. All these photos are from 5 years after planting. And you notice they're using very, very specific planting methods here. They're trying to plant next to some kind of sheltering object, and they'll generally have a plan to plant on the more north or east side to provide that extra shelter and hopefully a beneficial microclimate. But it doesn't always work out if the sheltering tree falls over and lands on your seedling. So unfortunately, I have a lot of photos that look like that, of seedlings that got a little squished. So maybe that's an indication that it's better to plant next to the log as on the right. Now, how this goes, just in terms of planting, is that you collect seed generally from at least the national forest where the planting is happening, ideally from as close to the site as possible. In Colorado, they're almost all grown out at Bessie Nursery in Nebraska in these little plugs for 1 year, and then transported in refrigerated trucks to whatever planting site, so on the side of the road in a national forest somewhere. And then they're planted out to fit to project specifications, which are generally pretty strict on tree density, any site prep that's going on, which could include some salvage logging, invasives control, animal control, and then sometimes they'll install shelters along with the trees, which are often like tubes that will protect it from gophers and hopefully from any freezes. And then afterwards, you have to monitor to ensure that you met your targets for surviving seedlings and a target tree density. So here's just one photo from the San Juan of a team out planting, and there you can see there's probably been some salvage logging here. There's a lot of trees that are cut, and the planting is happening a few years after that. In this case, I think it's a spruce fir forest, so it had burned very hot and severe. So all the large mature trees died, and they're trying to get some seedlings out and established to allow for future forests in this area. And what you do basically is you scrape away a certain patch, plop your tree down in the middle, and walk on to the next one. Okay, so now I'm going to go through what makes an area good to plant or not. So in this particular tool that I'm running through is from a paper from Camille Stevens-Roman and Penelope Morgan from a couple of years ago. That is a great review paper. It was like my second choice for required reading. That is basically the big punchline is this decision tool for planting. So what conditions on the forest that you can identify spatially that really contribute to greater seedling survival? And what does that look like? So the big one basically is the climate and the forest type. So wetter areas of a given forest type are just more likely to allow seedlings to survive. So the cooler and moister areas here, which is being signified by topographic water index, so how wet is it? And any of the moister areas are more likely to have seedling survival. And I've definitely seen that in the data that I've been working with on seedlings and plantings. Areas that are right next to a little stream will have much better survival than areas up on an arid, dry hill slope. And then this other big one to consider if you need to plant an area, how far is it to the living trees, especially if you're working with a species like ponderosa that just won't establish well, 100 meters past the surviving trees. So anywhere over 200 meters, you're definitely going to need to plant that if you want it to be a forest on any kind of time scale that, you're at a human time scale that you're concerned with. And then aspect and elevation, which kind of feeds back into climate and moisture. So if you're on a northeast slope, it's generally a little cooler and wetter. Seedlings are more likely to survive. The southwest slopes, if you pop a seedling in there and you have a drought the next year, it's a lot more likely that that seedling will die. And then slope was kind of lower priority. Basically steeper slopes, it's a little harder. And also steeper slopes are generally less of a target for planting just for access reasons. So basically shallower slopes, which is, in this case, we're looking at less than 45 degree, which is a pretty steep slope, is generally going to be better for planting and survival. And then you have to consider other factors like competing vegetation, soils, and I think a really big one is just microsite conditions. Even if you have like a southwest slope with, far in a like steep aspect or south aspect and steep slope, if there's like a rock in the right spot to catch soil and enough moisture, that still might be an okay spot. Yeah, and of course you have to consider all this in the frame of what species you're working with and what the genotypes are. Working with local seeds generally is much better. And what I've been finding and some of the work I've been doing is barely touching on like the topic of assisted migration, where you move trees from one source elsewhere where they might have a better chance at survival in the future. And what I've been finding is that even in a matter of a couple 100 meters, if you move seed source uphill, you have better survival than if you're moving it a couple 100 meters downhill. So even when it's considered safe and within the right seed source area, if you're just taking those more arid adapted genotype individuals and moving them up just a little bit, they have better survival. I'm getting close to the end, I think. Okay, so when you apply those aspects spatially through this great tool from Kyle Rodman, you can kind of identify specific areas and patches on the landscape that are great for planting. This is part of the High Park Fire that I pulled together just as an example. I think that picture I showed of just grassland is somewhere in this landscape. And you can see, at least with current climate, there are some areas that are much better, more suitable for planting and seedling survival based on those factors than others. But if you consider climate change, with future climate, with the extreme emissions, which is kind of the trajectory we're probably on, you lose a lot of those suitable areas, and it's relatively constrained about what areas will be good for planting. Now, just to touch on monitoring, I'm almost done. Here we see the stake row monitoring data that I've been working with. So it's collected out in the planting units at interval at planting, at 1 year after, 3 year after, 5 year after, and really that's like 1, 3, and 5 growing seasons. And you're just tracking here survival through time by species. You can see there's a big range. Some fires had better survival than others. Las Conchas is unfortunately one that had major failures in the plantings because they had just some bad drought right after it was planted. But others, they have somewhat better survival. But really, generally, if you see about 75% survival, you're doing pretty good at 5 years. And obviously, some units will just have planting failure and have less than 25% survival just the next year. And that's unfortunate, but hopefully by considering these different factors that go into success and using tools, we can push this towards better survival for 2020 planting. Like some of the work that I'm doing, hopefully will be able to be applied by next year when the planting for the 2020 fires is probably going to start. So we'll be doing a little bit of field work in some of these fire burned areas over the summer, and hopefully we'll have more conclusions on what's contributing to success at some of these sites and what's not leading to success at others. Okay, so just to wrap it up quickly, the 2020 fires are basically very large, and they're just adding a very large amount of area that needs to be planted to a backlog of a very large area that needs to be planted. So it's kind of compounding the issues with forest management and recovery. The history of fire exclusion is one of the big parts of the problem, and one of the big causes of the problems we're seeing with current fires in much of the West, but it's not exclusive. Climate is definitely contributing to extreme fire in many areas now. And forest recovery trajectories, we looked at resilience and vegetation type conversion. And then post-fire kind of adaptive management strategies, whether it's thinning, burning, planting, or just waiting and seeing. A lot of managers I've talked to are seeing conversion on their forests, but a lot of times they either don't have the resources or plan to address that at that time beyond, certain plantings in high severity fire patches. So a lot of the time, we'll just have to kind of wait and see what happens to that recovery trajectory. So I think that wraps it up for me. Can take questions now.
Gloria, it looks like you're muted still, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Laura. That was great.
Thank you, Laura. That was a lot of information. I'm glad we're recording this so people can go back and digest some of the details of your graphs, but they seem to generally substantiate a lot of science that's been coming out about recent changes with great forests and increasing temperatures and changing habitats. If we're ready for questions, it seems like some of the main questions are talking about how much we should assist this migration and adaptation to climate change. First, before we get into student questions, I wanted to go back to a topic that you brought up of identifying a little bit more about the difference between intensity and severity. So just really briefly, like, a couple sentences about your perspective about that.
Right. So the way I like to think about it, just to keep it simple, is intensity happens during the fire. So long flame length, high temperatures, very kind of chemical processes of fire. Severity happens after. So how much of the tree has died, how much of the tree is scorched, how much of the ground has the ground been affected, is it hydrophobic? So severity happens afterwards, intensity happens during.
Okay, kind of like the difference between fire behavior and fire results.
Right.
Fire impacts. Okay, great. I'm glad we got back to that. Thank you. So this is kind of the student question number one kind of wraps up a bunch of questions. maybe we can wrap them up together. Should forest managers try to prevent forest conversion or allow these ecological changes to happen naturally? And I guess we can expand that question to, do we also support assisted migration? You know, you were talking about those few hundred meters up or down. Do we plant to adapt to what we think is coming? Or do we plant to continue what we want and what was there? And if you have time, you can also maybe toss in a little bit about animal species and wildlife species as well.
Okay.
Two big good questions. So how much should we help?
So here's the thing. There is a certain mandate to maintain the forest resources as they are, whether or not that's even possible, given the changes that we're seeing in the forests across the West. Basically, if you have a forested area, you're going to have to manage it as a forested area. And if all your trees burn down, you're going to have to plant some just to maintain that stocks on the landscape, just from a very, I guess, management focused perspective. Whether or not that is, well, to some degree that's happening. Just the scale of the issue is so big that there's just not resources available to address every area that's at risk or in the process of going through type conversion. As you really are seeing this all over. As in the Coop paper, they give examples all over from the West. And I've been involved in a number of research projects that are looking at that. Just this, I don't know, just the scale is just mind-boggling if you're coming from working on just one little watershed and one forest. But anyway, so just starting from the position that you want to keep a forested area forest, some of that comes back, I think, to the initial adaptive management kind of question where, so if you've identified your goals, and so this area, say, is right next to a, say a riparian area that you want to, make a bigger effort to keep trees on the land to support, I guess, that broader community, then you'd probably be more active in what management choices you make. In terms of assisted migration, there's been very limited implementation of that. So for like the seed collection for the planting that I've been talking about, they have a specific elevation range that you're supposed to source your seed from. Sometimes it's stretched a little bit just based on seed availability for a given year. Like I already know that like next year, they're going to be just racing to grow as many seedlings as possible to plant out for all the projects that are getting started up. So sometimes they use older seed that was collected years ago from the same forest up to multiple decades. I've seen in the forest I was looking at up to 40-year-old seed had been used. Mm-hmm. If I'm reading like the codes right and no one made a typo. I'm still in the process of checking some of that stuff. And often they use recently collected seed. It's more likely to have success that way. And where you use the seed from and where you put it is kind of up to the specific manager on the forest right now. So long as they're acting within their given mandate and prescription, I guess, for the planting plan. I think if you want to continue to have trees and greater success, of your plantings, you're definitely going to have to consider how drought adapted are the seeds that we're putting on the landscape in the future. So obviously we've been seeing more success from more drought adapted trees that are planted out into a drought. So it's kind of hopefully an obvious one for managers that are working on this issue. When you think more about assisted migration, you think more about like moving things long distance, maybe between mountain ranges, using completely different species and assisting like an area from, say, low elevation conifer forest to upper like pinyon juniper woodland maybe. I think there has been some planting of like pinyon slightly higher up. in some areas in New Mexico, that like in the Las Conchas, they're probably going to have to plant out pinyon if you want it on that burnt out lower mesa. But that's something that's more talked about, I think, in the literature and in research than has actually been applied. In animals, I know less, I guess, about what they're doing with assisted migration, because I think it's more likely that the animals are going to assist themselves in moving, so long as there's some level of connectivity in the landscape. So like the example of the Mountain Graham red squirrel that's super endangered. There's like 53 of them, I think, right now. And there was like 16 a year ago. They're a lot more concerned about other species moving in. So like one of their big issues is like the invasive gray squirrels that are taking up some of the red squirrel habitat on the mountain. So they're any management promoting red squirrel usually involves removing as many of the gray squirrels as you can. And let's see.
Laura, I have a couple of, we're getting a little bit closer to our time, although we have a little bit of flexibility. We have a couple of specific questions I wanted to give a chance to answer. In regards to your presentation and your answer recently, Dawn Barton wanted to know, can you be briefly more specific about what mandate you're referring to, which I think was the U.S. Forest Service mandate for restoration?
Let's see. There I'm like recalling third hand what I've read in papers suggesting that you need to maintain the forested landscape as forested. So sorry, I don't have a very like specific line to cite, but I think generally it's more a concern that you want to maintain, you know, certain resources on the land, which includes forested landscape in certain areas.
Yeah, currently mandated to try to maintain resilient conditions rather than change them.
Yeah. Yeah, that might be referring to like earlier periods when you wanted to keep every tree on the forest that you could. So I think it's evolved since then, but yeah.
We have one really great question. I'm sorry, we probably won't be able to get to all of them. Donna Sharak, Region 2, wanted to know, we talk about conifer seedlings needing cooler and moisture conditions to be successful. At what age do you think in your studies do some of these conifer seedlings become less sensitive to hotter and drier conditions, more resilient, like Engelmann spruce, for example? But what age do you see that they become a little tougher?
Let's see, that's a hard one. There's a lot of I'd say not within the 5-year period that I've been looking at. So let's see, sometimes between 5 and 100 years. Sorry. Yeah, I think once you have your root system relatively well established, I think it'll be a lot more resilient to drought. So long as it's planted well with you know, the connectivity of soil, within maybe 10 years, I'd hope it would be a little bit more resilient.
Let's see. Any consideration of understory plant species in a successional trajectory back to the forest? For example, fireweed, and ericaceous species versus graminoids in subalpine zones. So if we help to facilitate some of these understory herbaceous plants, does that help to facilitate reestablishment of conifers?
Let's see.
It depends.
That I'm really not an understory plant person, unfortunately, but I think I've read some papers based in California that address that issue. So I'd go to look at some of that literature to answer that question, which I think there is an association, but like I'm not sure about like the specifics in Colorado that would apply.
Okay. And just before we wind up, for any of you that have posted questions that we aren't getting to, the chat we can save and send to Laura, and if she wants to follow up with any further answers or reach out to some of you that didn't get your questions answered, you know, we can do some more of that offline. Have you recently done assessments pre-COVID at Cheeseman Reservoir? If you did, what year was it? And was that seedling tree survival?
I haven't. What the data that I'm working with is all been collected by other people's, and I'm just streamlining it and putting it into one project. So this summer, we're definitely going to be out on the Waldo fire and certain other areas. Sorry, I don't have more of an answer than that, but I haven't been out to many of these areas yet.
Yeah. Well, your topic I really like that it encompassed everything from down near Tucson to all the way up here. And it's amazing to see so many of the similarities that we're dealing with across the. So there's lots of sharing on chat. I think we are at time. Let me see if we can conifer ceilings, which a decision tree. I think we pretty much addressed everything. And there's some comments for the cat that we really appreciate the cat input. Her comments were really important. So thank you very much for attending. Why would you like to wind us up?